Hi there and welcome back. In this section we're going to be taking a look at the features within the channel rack and piano roll, and generally explaining how it all works. To best demonstrate these elements, I'm going to be using the project file of the song that we will eventually create in this course, as this will make following along and understanding the principles just that much easier. So let's begin with the channel rack. Now within the channel rack are all of our instruments and audio samples, and each pattern has access to all of these via this channel rack. I'm going to go through and explain what you're currently seeing on screen right now to give you a good starting point. So the first of these grey rectangular boxes all contain audio samples, and in this case they happen to be individual drum sounds. To load a sample into the channel rack, open the browser and look to where you've stored some sounds, then click and drag a sample into the rack like that. If I click in the first box here, which is a kick drum, it opens what we call the sampler channel settings. So this is a native sampler instrument that we can particularly use to edit one-shot sounds such as drums. It's broken into three main sections, however, only the page that you see now is relevant to a beginner's course. So like before, let's go through the parameters one step at a time to break everything down. On the top right here, we have the pan function. So this will determine whereabouts in the stereo field your sound will be placed. So let's move it around to give you an audible demonstration of how it works. And you should be able to hear the sound travel from the left to right speaker. So next to the pan we have the channel volume, which works differently to say the volume control in the mixer, but at this stage you don't need to worry about it. So besides volume is the pitch control, and we can change the amount of semitones we can adjust within the pitch by changing this value in the red box beside it. So currently this will adjust the pitch up to 2 semitones, whereas if I say put it up to 12, that's going to go the full range of the octave. Then in the upper right hand corner here is the target mixer track function, which allows you to route your sound to an insert on the mixer. Again, we'll look at the mixer in later videos, so we can just skip this for now. Now below here is the time stretching tab. So again we have another pitch control which works slightly different to the above pitch control in that it keeps the time of the sample constant and won't change the speed depending what way you move it. So I can move it up a full octave, and the actual time and length of the sample will remain the same, and vice versa. Next to that we have two time stretching functions. So the first one can be used for quick adjustments to the sample length. And the second function determines the amount of time the sample lasts. Now beside that is a drop down menu from which we can choose various stretching algorithms. And this is slightly more advanced, so we won't be covering it here. So let's move down below. Here we have pre-computed effects, and again some of these switches aren't relevant to a beginner, but at this stage you may want to play around with, say, the reverse function to maybe achieve a bit of variation in, say, your drum parts. And you may also want to normalize some samples from time to time if they are inherently quiet. So what normalize does is to maximize the sample without clipping it, or in other words without exceeding 0 decibels. This sample's already quite loud, so it's not really going to be obvious here. The other switches here in this section, such as direct current offset and polarity flip, are for down the line when you may have issues with certain plugins or phase issues. So below that we have a quick sample fade in and out function. And then beside that we have a pogo effect, which won't be heard so well on a kick drum, but basically it applies a pitch effect bend to your sample, and it can actually be useful again for other drum sounds. Now the crossfade loop function next to that allows you to crossfade the sample to create a smooth loop section like so. And next to that is trim, which will cut any silence within the sample. So if you have a gap of silence before and after your sound, trim can be handy in keeping things tidy and also to free up memory depending on how much it trims out. So over to the left here is a loop section which contains options to loop a sample that has loop points stored in its properties. Now this particular kick drum sample doesn't, which is why it's greyed out at the moment. And finally below here we have a visual representation of the sound in this sample view. So if I hover over it, you'll see the sample properties appear in the hint bar just above the browser in the upper left hand corner and below the toolbar. You may have noticed that this hint bar is available whenever I hover over any parameter, so I'd recommend referencing it often in these early stages. This sample view basically just gives us information such as bit depth, sample rate, stereo configuration, and so on. And if we right click it, we also have some more options to explore. So if it's a loop, we can detect the sample or detect the tempo of it, for instance, and we can also have different waveform views, including spectrum view and multi-channel view. So there's spectrum, and here's multi-channel. So let's close this by pressing F12, which is a handy shortcut to close all currently open windows other than the channel rack. Now back in the channel rack here, we also have the same controls for volume and panning. So pans on the left, and volumes here. And we can just right click to reset them to the default value anytime we want. And the number beside here assigns the sample to a mixer track like we've already discussed. Now the green light beside pan and volume is used to mute and solo individual elements. So pressing this would turn it off and then back on again. Now we can sort these various samples within the channel rack into separate groups, which helps to keep things organized. So by holding right click and selecting the switches to the right of the boxes, we can choose which elements to categorize. So if I highlight just the drums and then I press Alt and G, we can then create a new separate drum group. Now I already have the elements sectioned off into various groups, but you can choose between each of them using the black drop-down menu available at the top of the channel rack here. So now I just want to quickly explain a little bit about this step sequencer. You'll notice that each channel has a row of 16 steps, which equates to individual 16th notes within a bar. We use these steps to create mainly drum patterns, so let's begin by activating a few steps by simply left clicking each step. I'll just switch to pattern mode here. We can then drag the edges on the channel rack outward to make room for more, so let's drag it out and add in an extra bar of time. Now let's just go back to one bar. And let's fill in all the steps of the hat to create a 16th note pattern so that I can demonstrate the function of the swing parameter here in the upper right of the channel rack. So this adds a swing rhythm by varying differences between odd and even step lengths, and I'll include a picture from the manual to give you an idea visually of what's actually happening here. Now, in addition to step sequence mode, we have a more elaborate and functional mode called the piano roll. To demonstrate this, I'm going to go to an empty pattern here. I'll just stay in channel 1 actually, and I'm going to use the plus symbol down here to load up one of FL Studio's native synth plugins. And I'm going to select Citrus. I'm going to browse for the preset called Music Box. And don't worry too much about what's going on just yet, because we will get into features such as opening synths and all in later videos. So using the yellow switch up in the upper right of the channel rack here, we can switch between step sequence overview and piano roll overview. So let's switch to the latter. Now if we click on the space where the steps used to be, we are brought into the piano roll. The other way of doing this would be to right click the sample instrument and select piano roll from there. But let's just click here for now. Out of all the DAWs, FL's piano roll has always been my favourite to work in, so let's get to it. It would take far too long to cover all of the features in a beginner's course, so I'm just going to focus on what I think is the most relevant to you at this stage. In the simplest of terms, the piano roll is where we construct our chords and melodies. To the left, on the vertical axis, we have a keyboard which tells us what notes are being used. Conversely, we have our measurements of time on the horizontal axis here, measured in bars. We have a bunch of different editing tools and menus which we will look into, but by default we're landed on the draw tool here, which is highlighted as this yellow pencil. I'm going to draw in some notes by left clicking on the grid, so let's draw in an E minor chord for instance, which would be comprised of an E note, G note and a B note. We can change the resolution of this grid using the horizontal bar at the top here. And in the upper right hand corner we have a vertical zoom. So as you can see, notes are displayed by these horizontal green bars, and by clicking and dragging individual notes we can change their duration. I'm going to select all three notes by double clicking and dragging along this black bar at the top, and I can change the duration of all three notes at once. So using this black bar to highlight notes, let's use Ctrl and C to copy the notes and then paste them into a pattern using Ctrl and V. So I'll shorten it to about there, and press Ctrl and C to copy, and then Ctrl and V to paste. And I'm just going to spread these little segments out. We can also transpose these notes up and down in pitch by highlighting again and moving vertically. But let's go back to single notes for a moment and demonstrate the slide function. So I'll just go back to a single E note. So on the upper left is this triangle icon, which when selected will create a new slide note. In order for a slide to happen, you must first have a regular note like we already do. So let's bring the slide on top of that and listen back. Now the slide isn't particularly audible here as the sound itself doesn't sustain for long enough, but this effect is better when applied to the likes of lead sounds. I'm going to go ahead and make another pattern again to demonstrate the next section, so let's just do a sort of E minor pattern again. And what I want to look at now are the note properties and the event editor down here. So the note properties are displayed as these vertical green lines at the bottom with a circle at the end of them. And by default these will control the note's velocity. So let's do an example of some changes in the velocity. You can also use the select tool to highlight individual notes and select individual velocities like that. Now if we click the control drop down menu beside this, we'll see a list of other note properties. So first let's take a look at pan. We can pan the notes over the course of this one bar by selecting different values of this function. So let's just do a gradual kind of pan pattern here. And just undo it back to default. We can also edit notes like this to control the velocity, fine-tuning, pitch and more. The other way we can do this is via the event editor using what is called event automation. So let's begin with editing the pitch. So right-clicking this will allow us to create a slope automation. While left click will snap the edits to the grid in blocks like this. We can also zoom in and out of the editor using this zoom tab again on the right hand corner. So let's go undo this pattern and put it back to a chord again. And now we can go to the top left and explore some of the relevant features within the toolbar. So the first arrow brings up a drop-down menu. And the first in this list is File. From here we can import what are known as MIDI files, which are bits of data containing note and automation information. If you're just starting out, you may wish to import some MIDI files to see how melodies and chords are usually constructed. Below that is Edit, which contains all of the usual shortcuts and so on. Now the Tools section is probably the most relevant menu in this section, as it contains some different creative methods that can help get you going in the piano roll. We'll take a look at quantizing in the drum section, but let's have a browse through some of the other functions, starting with Chop, which chops the chords into segments determined by the value that you choose to set. So let me just go back and hit play first. We also have an arpeggio tool, which you might find quite inspiring at this stage of learning, so let me just go through some of its capabilities quickly. So as you can hear, we can change things like the range in octaves, the pattern it plays, the duration and even more. This is a handy tool to quickly develop parts that would otherwise take more thinking. It's not always the best option, but keep in mind as you're starting out that you may want to use these sorts of things. Back into Tools. We also have things such as Strum, which will alter the velocity and timing to try and replicate a strummed instrument so it sounds a bit like this. Now the last thing you might want to check out here is the randomizer, which will generate random patterns according to the scale that you determine. Now this is familiar in ways to the arpeggio, and it can generate fast results with no effort. This might feel like it takes some of the life out of the musical process, so it's really up to you to determine whether or not you want to use it. I'll just do a quick demonstration. So I'm going to change the key to say F, and then the scale to, I'll just pick anything at random. Let me just go back out and hit play actually. Now back into the main drop-down menu, we also have things like View and Stamp, and from View you can change the layout to suit your sort of personal preferences and tastes. The rest on the list aren't particularly helpful to you right now, so let's just keep moving on. So next to the drop-down menu is a shortcut to the Tools menu. And then beside that we have another Snap to Grid function, which you've already seen before, but I'll quickly just show you how it changes with respect to different settings quickly again. So switch it to say a 6th step. There you can see that the grid has shortened itself. Then we have a stamp tool. Now this isn't relevant to us at this stage, so we can go over to this, which is the draw tool. And that's what we've been using so far to draw notes in. But beside that we have two different paint functions. And these allow us to paint in multiple notes at a time as we move across, rather than just the one. So I'm going to select one and just drag across. And you'll notice after I paint the line of notes that an arrow shows up to the right of the sequence, and we can drag this arrow to change the overall length on a 0 grid basis. Then after the paint tools we have a delete switch, but I tend to either right click or use the delete button on the keyboard as it's much simpler. We also have a mute function which allows us to mute one or more notes at a time, which may be helpful in determining problem notes within a chord sequence. Slice here will let us cut right through the middle of a note to break it up, so I can just click anywhere in the middle of these chords and I'll break the note up. And the next 4 tabs here are fairly self-explanatory. We have select, zoom, playback and another play pause function. So one last thing I think I forgot to cover was the options available whenever you right click one of the sampler channels within the rack. So if I go back to drums here, I'm going to just right click, and from here we can do things like rename, change color, add an icon, load different samples, and also the likes of clone, delete and replace. So all of these are fairly self-explanatory again. You can also move channels up and down by selecting one, holding shift and scrolling up or down. So if I hold shift and use the mouse wheel, I can then move that to wherever I want. So that wraps up this section, and now we can move on to take a look at the playlist, so I'll see you there.